Hey, everybody. Welcome to Read and Reaction. My name is Will Miles. If you haven't seen this before, typically here on Read and Reaction, we cover Florida football, but certainly we are interested in what goes on outside of Florida as well, especially when it comes to college football and the college football playoff. With Florida out of the playoffs, all we got to talk about, if we're Florida fans, is what went on this weekend. And wow, what an interesting Saturday it was. You've got Georgia going down 27-24 to Alabama. You've got Michigan beating Iowa 26-0. You've got Washington beating Oregon 34-31. You've got Florida State beating Louisville 16-6 with their third string quarterback in the game. You've got Texas beating Oregon State 49-21, and you've got like I mentioned, Alabama at number 8, winning that game 27-24 over Georgia. The interesting thing, I think, is that people are going to talk about, and Kirby Smart specifically is going to talk about, his team would be favored, or his team is the best team to be out there on the field in the Final Four. And I think that's a really interesting point, considering that his team was favored by 5.5 points over Alabama, still loses that game. You can make the same statement about Washington. Washington was a 9.5 point underdog to Oregon. And in fact, if you look at some of the advanced stats, I think you can make a point that coming into the game, Oregon was the better team, but obviously Washington gets the win. And that's one of the reasons why I think we got to kind of throw out some of these things and sort of move forward with who actually won the games. Obviously, the win for Florida State, pretty ugly, 16-6 versus Louisville, but it is really impressive when you think about what the Seminoles have done. So Rodemaker goes out with a concussion on the late hit by Jaden Hill for Florida in the game against the Gators last week. You've got Glenn come in for a couple of plays. Florida State's able to put that game away, but in the second half, Florida State was down 12-0, and they win that game 24-15. So pretty much after the safety, Florida State didn't give up anything to Florida, and in this game against Louisville, didn't give up anything. Big time goal line stop. Almost had a touchdown to the tight end going down the sideline, but weren't able to get it done there for Louisville, and so Florida State ends up winning that game by 10 points. Now, look, obviously, wearing the logo, this is where we are in terms of who I cover and where I went to school. I am a Gator fan, so I hate Florida State and I hate Georgia. So the fact that those two are arguing about who's going to be the last one in is equal parts both excruciating and hilarious for me. But hey, look, we're going to try to look at some stats. We're going to look at the schedules, and then I'm going to give you my opinion about where these teams should be. So first, let's talk about where we were coming in. So the number one team was Georgia. Georgia's undefeated, hasn't lost in 25, 26 games. Certainly the class of the SEC, two-time defending national champions. You've got Michigan at number 2. They've won the last 3 games without Harbaugh, have Harbaugh back for this Big Ten championship against Iowa. Obviously, the East and the West divisions make it to where you don't necessarily have the two best teams in the Big Ten playing in this game. That's a shame. At the same time, Michigan does get the job done. You've got Washington with Michael Penix Jr. transferring over from Indiana for the last couple of years. DeBoer's done a really nice job there with the Huskies since he took over. You had Florida State at number 4 with Jordan Travis going out with a broken leg, Tate Rodemaker out with a concussion, and still able to get the job done there against Louisville. You have Oregon at number 5. Bo Nix has done a really nice job since he's gone up there for Dan Lanning. You got Ohio State at number 6. They were idle this week. You've got Texas at number 7, won 49-21 versus Oregon State. You've got Alabama at number 8, won against Georgia. You've got 9, Missouri, they're idle, and 10, Penn State. So that's who the committee had ranked 1 through 10 coming in. So I think it's interesting then to say, hey, coming in, where did these teams stand? And the interesting thing is if you look at the differential for advanced stats, and I tend to like the advanced stats because that's who I am. I'm sort of a stats nerd. Look, Oregon actually had the largest differential between their offensive and defensive EPA. That's why Oregon was favored. That's why a lot of people picked Oregon, because at the end of the day, Oregon probably is one of the best teams in the country, given what we've seen. The only 2 losses they have now are to Washington, and they're both 1-score losses. So Oregon's really good teams. And even if you look at yards per play, they're up there in the top as well. 2.6 yards per play difference between what their offense is getting and their defense is giving up. That's the highest out of all the top 10. So if we were just going to say, hey, teams out on the field, eye test, who's going to win? To me, you probably make the case for Oregon from the standpoint of, from an advanced stats perspective, They are the best team in terms of differential, at least coming into this Washington game. Now, I don't have all the stats for that, but it's not going to change it that much because it's the 13th game of the year. Oregon should be up there. The second best team when it comes to EPA, Ohio State. So their offensive EPA 0.326, their defense negative 0.001. So their differential 0.327. That's actually a big step down from Oregon, but their differential between offensive yards per play and defensive yards per play allowed 2.3. That is the second best out of these top 10. So we've heard a lot of people talk about Georgia losing their conference championship game and still being in. But what about Ohio State, who loses to Michigan, who's up there in the top, basically going to be number one now that Georgia's lost? That's the only loss Ohio State has. They've beaten some other teams. We're going to go through the schedules individually. But look, I think you can make a case that the Buckeyes deserve a shot more than Georgia does. Now, Georgia, 2.4 yards per play difference coming into this game between their offense and their defense in terms of yards per play. Their offensive EPA 0.386, their defensive 0.082, so not as good as Ohio State, and so they're at 0.304. They're the fourth best team behind Michigan when it comes to EPA differential. So the top four, if we were just looking at EPA, at least coming into this game, would be Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, and Georgia. Interestingly, then you go Penn State, Florida State, Alabama, Texas, Washington, and Missouri. So advanced stats really don't like Washington, and we'll talk about that in a minute as to why that probably is when we get to Washington's schedule individually. If we look at yards per play differential overall, I actually misspoke when I said that Ohio State was second. They're actually third because Oregon is first, then Georgia, then Ohio State, then Michigan, then Washington, then Florida State, then Penn State, then Texas, then Alabama and Missouri. So we're making arguments about Texas and Alabama, and I think rightly so. We're making arguments about Georgia, but really the reality is that Texas, Alabama, and Washington likely are worse teams overall than Georgia. At the same time, that's not how college football decides its playoff. It hasn't been how college football has ever decided its playoff. And so it's curious to me that now we're going to make these arguments about the best four teams. I think EPA difference is probably the best way to do it. We can recalculate it once all the numbers are in. But I think what you're going to find, I don't think Florida State advanced their EPA numbers much tonight at all. Alabama probably didn't advance them very much either, certainly not enough to get to where they need to be. They're at 0.193 for their differential. Georgia is at 0.304. And honestly, I think if Georgia and Alabama played again, I think Georgia would be favored. And I think that probably makes sense. We saw that a couple of years ago where Alabama beat Georgia in the SEC championship and then lost in the actual national championship game. That happens all the time. So there are better teams that lose in these championship games, and that's just sort of the way things go. So let's look at each team individually schedule wise, and we can talk a little bit about what they've done this year. So if we look at Washington, they opened up against Boise State 56-19. They then played Tulsa 43-10. They beat Michigan State 41-7. So I do think you need to give them some credit that they had a Big Ten scheduled game. Now, obviously, things fell apart for the Spartans this year. At the same time, you got to give them credit for trying to schedule that game. They beat Cal 59-24, and now we start to get into why Washington is not liked by a lot of folks in the analytical community. They beat Arizona on the road 31-24. They beat Oregon 36-33. So that's a top 10 win. That's a good win. They beat Arizona State 15-7. So another one-score win. They beat Stanford 42-33. Stanford's not a very good team. They beat USC 52-42. They beat Utah 35-28, another one-score win. Oregon State 22-20, another one-score win. Washington State 24-21, another one-score win. And Oregon 34-31. So their overall point differential, they have averaged winning their 13 games by 14 points. One-score games, though, they've had 7. So Washington's been very, very lucky to go 13-0. And so this, I think, is the crux of the argument that we're going to have when it comes to the teams that aren't in. Now, everybody's basically penciling Washington in as the team that should, obviously they've secured their spot, won the Pac-12, beat Oregon twice, 13-0, all that sort of stuff. And when you look at them, look, they beat 6 ranked teams. They beat Oregon, USC, Utah, Oregon State, and Oregon again. So 5 ranked teams, sorry. But they didn't beat them impressively. And I think that's one of the things that if you're going to dock a team like Florida State for having its third quarterback and for not winning games impressively, you got to apply the same standard to Washington. So it's interesting to me that that's not being applied. Now, look, when we look at Michigan, their average margin of victory is 27.2. and they've had two one-score games. So they beat East Carolina 30-3, UNLV 35-7, Bowling Green 31-6, Rutgers 31-7. So that's your out of conference schedule for Michigan. That's brutal, guys. East Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, and then Rutgers obviously is an in conference opponent, but kind of like a cupcake anyway when you think about Rutgers. Then you got Nebraska 45-7, Minnesota 52-10, Indiana 52-7, Michigan State 49-0, Purdue 41-13, Penn State 24-15, so much closer. And Penn State is a team that's in the top 10 of the playoff rankings. They beat Maryland 31-24, so a one-score game there. They beat Ohio State 30-24. And then they beat Iowa 26-0 tonight. So, like I said, they've got two one-score wins. They've won by an average of 27.2. If you're gauging the resume of Michigan and Washington, I think it's pretty clear in terms of, who should be ranked above the other one. Michigan has won games more impressively, and they've got better advanced statistics than Washington. So I think you put Michigan ahead of them. So let's look at Florida State. So Florida State, interestingly, hasn't played anybody who's in the top 10. So they played LSU to start with, won 45-24. LSU's just outside of that top 10. I think they're ranked 13th overall. So that is a quality win, but still not in the top 10. Southern Mississippi, 66-13. Boston College, 31-29. They are not a very good team, and so that one's sticking. 31-24 over Clemson. Got pretty lucky to win that game, win it overtime, but honestly, Clemson should have won that one. They beat Virginia Tech 39-17, then Syracuse 41-3, Duke 38-20. Wake Forest 41-16, Pitt 24-7, Miami 27-20. So there's a one score. North Alabama 58-13. That's the game where Jordan Travis goes down. They beat Florida 24-15, but they were down 12-0 in that one. Rodemaker leads them back, and then Louisville 16-6 with their backup quarterback Glenn. So they have averaged 21.1 points per game in terms of their margin of victory. They've got 3 one-score victories, and look, they handled Louisville pretty well. And again, I think when you look back at what they needed to do, their defense knew it needed to shut people down. And they were able to do that in the second half against Florida, and they were able to do that all game against Louisville. That's pretty impressive. So again, you start looking at the advanced statistics. I don't think Florida State is one of the best 4 teams in the country. I don't. I certainly don't when they don't have Jordan Travis in there, but they're the 6th best team in the country by EPA differential. If you look at yards per play differential, they're also the 6th best team in the country, but you've got a 2-loss Oregon team in front of them in those rankings and a 1-loss Ohio State team in front of those rankings. So that to me is the question. Obviously, Oregon, I think nobody is going to put in there, though I think you can make an argument in terms of like eye test and are they better and those sorts of things. But look, it's an Ohio State thing there for me when it comes to Florida State. If you think Ohio State's a better team than Florida State, then you put Ohio State in there, other than some of these other teams. All right, so if we look at Texas has one top 10 victory. They beat Alabama. Other than that, so the first game of the year, Rice 37-10. Second one is a 34-24 win at Tuscaloosa. So at Alabama. Obviously, that's going to come up when we talk about the Tide and how we rank things. Wyoming, 31-10. Baylor, 38-6. Kansas, 40-14. Oklahoma, they lost 34-30. That's at a neutral site, so their loss was not a home game, also not on the road. They've proven they can win on the road, though. One-score game. Houston, 31-24, another one-score game. The BYU, 35-6. Kansas State, 33-30, another one-score game. Texas Christian, 29-26, another one-score game. Iowa State, 26-16. Texas Tech, 57-7. Oklahoma State, 49-21. So they've won by an average of 18.6 points per game. They've got 4 one-score games. So if you go back, 3 for one-score games for Florida State, 2 for Michigan, 7 for Washington. So I think you can make an argument that Texas has had a better season than Washington. At the same time, Texas hasn't had to play the same quality of opponents as Washington. Washington had to play Oregon twice. If you think Alabama's better than Washington, then or better than Oregon, then okay. But look, there's nothing here that like differentiates Texas other than that win over Alabama. So that takes us to Alabama. If we look at Alabama's schedule, they beat Mississippi State 56-7. They lost to Texas 24-34. They beat South Florida 17-3. That's the game where Jalen Milroe was benched. They bring Milroe back against Ole Miss, win 24-10. And again, that's one of those top 15 wins. It's kind of impressive. They beat Mississippi State 40-17, beat Texas A&M 26-20, Arkansas 24-21. That's probably the least impressive victory they have. They beat Tennessee 34-20. 20. LSU 42-28. That's really when they started to take off. Beat Kentucky 49-21. Chattanooga 66-10. Way to schedule those tough ones there, Alabama. Then you've got Auburn 27-24, win on a last second throw in, and they beat Georgia 27-24. So the average margin of victory for Alabama 16.7. They've got 5 one-score wins. So again, I think if you go, I think I would put Alabama in front of Washington overall in terms of quality. The only difference is Alabama only played Georgia, but they did have LSU and Ole Miss on their schedule and lose to Texas. So there's a top 10 loss. But again, I think you got to give them credit for scheduling a team like that. And that does weigh with me that you're scheduling that team out of conference as opposed to what we're going to look at next, the Georgia Bulldogs. So Georgia, Tennessee Martin 48-7, beat Ball State 45-3, beat South Carolina 24-14, down 14-3 at the half in that one. They beat UAB 49-21, Auburn 27-20. So if you're going to dock Alabama for having a last second win against Auburn, you probably ought to do the same for Georgia. They beat Kentucky 51-13, beat Vanderbilt 37-20, beat Florida 43-20, beat Missouri 30-21. And again, it was really pretty close, though Missouri again is in the top 10 for the playoff. Beat Ole Miss 52-17, beat Tennessee 38-10, beat Georgia Tech 31-23, and then lost to Alabama 27-24. The average margin of victory for Georgia, 21.8. One-score victories, only 3 of them. So I think, again, if you look at EPA, you look at yards per play, you look at what they've done throughout the season, I think you can make an argument that Georgia's one of the best 4 teams. I think you can do that pretty solidly. Problem is they lost to Alabama. And the way these things are sort of sitting, that I think is going to weigh heavily when it comes to the committee's thought process. So now let's look at Ohio State. And this is the one that's been left out of all of the discussion. So again, as a Florida fan, I dislike Georgia, or I hate Georgia. I hate Florida State. I dislike Ohio State quite a bit. I actually grew up in the state of Indiana. If you grow up in Indiana, you're either a Notre Dame fan, an Indiana fan, or a Purdue fan. I happen to be an Indiana fan, which means you hate Ohio State because they come in and beat you by 50 pretty much every year. But luckily you can get back at them during basketball season. So look, they beat Indiana 23-3. They beat Youngstown State 35-7. They beat Western Kentucky 63-10. Beat Notre Dame 17-14. That's a pretty good win. They beat Maryland 37-17. Purdue 41-7. They beat Penn State 20-12. Pretty much the same kind of margin of victory that Michigan had over Penn State. They beat Wisconsin 24-10. They beat Rutgers 35-16. They beat Michigan State 38-3. They beat Minnesota 37-3, and they lose 30-24 to Michigan. That keeps them out of the Big Ten championship game, but their average margin of victory 21.8, 3 one-score wins. So here's where I want to actually really stop for a second. So remember, average margin of victory for Ohio State 21.8, one-score wins 3. They played Notre Dame, who's sort of a top 15 team. They played Penn State, who is a top 10 team by the committee. They played Michigan, and they lost to Michigan. Now let's look at Georgia. 21.8 average margin of victory, 3 one-score games. They played Missouri, who's a top 10 team. They lost to Alabama, who's a top 10 team. They also played Ole Miss, who's sort of in that same range as Notre Dame. You could argue that Kentucky and Tennessee are maybe better than some of the teams in the Big Ten. I would probably agree with you in that capacity, but there's not a lot of difference between Georgia and Ohio State's resume. The difference is that Georgia won the East, whereas Michigan and Ohio State happen to be in the same division. That's one of the reasons, or that is the reason why Michigan got to play Iowa at the end. But if you're going to make an argument for Georgia losing to Alabama and then being in, I think you can make the same argument for Ohio State losing to Michigan and being in. And look, it's not like they're any better. From a margin of victory perspective, Ohio State's right there with Georgia. From an EPA perspective, they're right there with Georgia. From a yards per play perspective, they're right there with Georgia. So the last team I think is worth going over, at least because I talked about the advanced stats, is Oregon. So Oregon beat Portland State 81-7. They beat Texas Tech 38-30. They beat Hawaii 55-10. They beat Colorado 42-6. We obviously know that's not as good a win as we thought it was. They beat Stanford 42-6. They lost to Washington 33-36. They beat Washington State 38-24. They beat Utah 35-6. California 63-19. USC 36-27. Arizona State 49-13. 13, Oregon State 31-7, and then lost to Washington by 3 points again, 34-31. Their average margin of victory, or average margin in the games, I've been saying margin of victory, but it includes losses as well, is 22.9, 3-1 score games. So better than Ohio State, better than Georgia. You look at the advanced stats, they're better than Ohio State and they're better than Georgia. And I think this, to me, is the big argument against the arguments that teams like Georgia are going to make. The argument that Georgia is going to make is, you saw us on the field. If we go out there and line up, you know we're going to beat these teams. And I think Oregon can actually make a better case for that than Georgia. Now, look, Kirby Smart and all the people who are Georgia Bulldog fans, they're going to say, yeah, but Oregon lost twice. And therein lies the problem with your argument if you're a Georgia Bulldog fan, because Texas beat Alabama and Alabama beat Georgia. And so if you're going to start relying on wins and losses rather than just who's the best team, then you got to put Alabama and Texas ahead of Georgia. If you're going to rely on advanced stats, or if you're going to rely on who is the best team, then Oregon has to be in. And then it's got to be a completely different set. In fact, again, if you go by just EPA differential, the playoff is Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, and Georgia. That's the top four by EPA. And then Penn State's actually fifth, which is one of the reasons why Ohio State and Michigan would make sense, right? If we're going to pick the best teams, let's look at it. Let's look at the advanced stats. Florida State then would be sixth, Alabama seventh, Texas eighth, Washington ninth, and Missouri 10th. So let's leave Washington out. Let's leave Texas out. Let's leave Alabama out. So the Big 12 champ, the Pac-12 champ, and the SEC champ, and the ACC champ, all out of the playoff. The only conference champion in is Michigan, because that's what the statistics say is the actual best team out on the field. And look, I respect what Kirby Smart has built at Florida. I respect that they've won 2 straight national championships, but the reality is they were not the best team on the field against Alabama, and they haven't been the best team on the field all year long when you look at some of these advanced statistics. Last year, they were absolutely the best team on the field, and I would have made the same argument if they'd lost in the SEC championship game. 2 years ago, they did lose in the SEC championship game and still made it in because they were one of the best 4 teams, and there just wasn't this logjam. But now you have this logjam, and I think it's worth asking, why do we play the games if what we're going to do is just have Florida State go out and prove that they can win a game with their third string quarterback and their defense? I mean, this is the equivalent of a few years ago, Florida in 2013, Florida lost their top 2 quarterbacks. They had Skyler Mortonwig playing at quarterback, and it just looked terrible. They were awful, and they got beat. You look at any team in the country, most of them lose their third string quarterback, and then they play a top 15 team. They're going to lose the game. Florida State did not. Florida State got the job done. As much as it pains me to say this, I think Florida State needs to be in the tournament. Same thing with Ohio State. Like, Ohio State, I think from an advanced statistics perspective, is a really, really good team. They're really close to Michigan. That game was really close. The game, had they driven down the field and scored a touchdown to end it, then they beat Iowa this week, and they're in there, and everybody's talking about how Michigan shouldn't be in there, or no one's talking about how Michigan shouldn't be in there, because essentially that was considered a de facto playoff game. And I guess the question that I have is, why, if that's true for the Pac-12, where you have Washington and Oregon, and whoever won that game, we were pretty much going to say gets a spot as the Pac-12 champion, I think. Maybe Oregon, you'd make an argument with some of these unbeaten teams, but then you'd only have 3 unbeaten teams, and then you'd have Oregon in the mix for the argument with the Alabamas and the Texases and the Georgias of the world. So look, I think from an advanced statistics perspective, I agree. Georgia should be in the playoff. I think they should be. But from the standpoint of what we actually value, because all these statistics are supposed to point towards who's going to win the game. They help set betting lines. They help us understand what might happen in the future, all those sorts of things. If we really want a competitive playoff, yeah, I think you put in Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, and Georgia. I think that's probably the best way to do it. I think those 4 end up being the teams that carry the way. But that's not the way this works. And it shouldn't be the way it works, because regardless of the advanced statistics, regardless of which team looks the best in their underwear when they get into the locker room, it should matter that you win your conference. It should matter that you win the game. And so I think it becomes pretty easy at that point to decipher who's in. You've got Michigan, who wins the Big Ten. They were number 2 ranked coming in. So they're obviously going to jump over Georgia, who loses. Michigan's the number 1 seed. I think that's pretty clear. Their advanced statistics point that they should be up there. They're 3rd overall in terms of EPA differential. Probably they may even jump Ohio State after this game against Iowa. But their advanced statistics point toward them being the best team overall. They're undefeated, and they've beaten everybody who's coming their way, and they've played a couple of top 10 teams that in the playoff rankings. So I think Michigan is a clear number 1. I think Washington ends up being the number 2. Again, undefeated team, 7 one-score wins. I don't think that they're the second best team in the country, but I think they have a quarterback who has a lot of moxie. I think they got the job done all year long. And they're the Pac-12 champion, and they're 13-0. They're undefeated. And if you're going to sit there and say winning actually matters, then hey, winning has to actually matter. And that's why I put Florida State number 3. And I know Florida State's going to be number 4 if they make the playoff, but Florida State should be number 3. Because again, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, if we're going to start putting undefeated teams in here, if we're going to value that, then we got to value it. And Florida State just ran the table, won the ACC. Their resume isn't great, but it is what it is, right? Like Georgia was making an argument on a schedule that really stunk, and then they face somebody good and they lose. And maybe that's the argument you'd make over Florida State, is that if Florida State had to play a real quality opponent in this ACC title game, they lose the game. But that's a hypothetical, right? They have 13-0. I think they make it in. So I got Michigan. I've got Washington. I've got Florida State as the number 3 seed, and that means the number 4 seed comes down to Alabama, Texas, and Georgia, and Ohio State, right? And so to me, this is where we again have to ask, why do we play the games? Because Alabama is the SEC champion. Not having the SEC champion in this particular setting is a problem, right? Not having the SEC champion in the playoff means you likely don't have the best team in the playoff. But Alabama lost to Texas, and they lost at home to Texas. And I get that it was early in the season. I get that Jalen Milroe wasn't playing as well as he was back then, or is playing much better now than he was back then. I understand Alabama's a better team, and I think Alabama against Texas on a neutral field probably wins that game. But Alabama had a shot to beat Texas, and they didn't do it. And so if you're going to say that it means anything, it's not like Texas lost to Vanderbilt. Texas lost to Oklahoma on a neutral field by 4 points. And they beat Alabama on Alabama's field by 10 points. And the fact that Nick Saban couldn't get his team ready to win that game at home early in the season is a reason to have Texas in front. Sarkisian was able to get his team ready to win that game on the road at Alabama. And some of that might be because Quinn Ewers, Texas's quarterback, had a year of experience and Milroe did not. Might be because Alabama wasn't really sure what they had in quarterback, didn't really know how to use Jalen Milroe. But this is the beauty of college football. And the next year, I actually think you could make some arguments that this is a new system, that with a new system, we're going to say we're going to have conference champions in this 12-team playoff, and then we're going to fill it with the best available teams. All right, well, now we can start having those discussions about, does head-to-head matter, or should it be statistics, or should it be eye test, or should it be who do we think would win, who's developed over time, all that sort of stuff. But the beauty of college football, this is why I hate the 12-team playoff idea. The beauty of college football is that the regular season actually matters. And so Alabama beating Georgia matters. And Georgia shouldn't get in the playoff because they didn't win all their regular season games. And hey, if there were 5 one-loss teams that were fighting for this and Georgia lost, maybe they stay in. But if you keep Georgia in the playoff, then the SEC championship meant nothing. And if you keep Alabama out of the playoff, the SEC championship game still meant something if Florida State lost, still meant something if Washington lost, still meant something if Michigan lost, and still meant something if Texas lost, to be honest with you. And so I think that's a positive thing for the sport, where you sit there and say, look, yeah, you won the SEC championship, but you lost to the Big 12 champion, and the Big 12 champion is the one who has that spot. So, hey, that's a problem. And Georgia, I get it. They had Oklahoma on the schedule, and if Georgia had beaten Oklahoma, we would probably be having a really weird conversation about this three-way tie, much like we did years ago when you had Texas, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma all in a tie. And I believe it was Texas that went to the national championship because of it. You'd have this weird three-way loop. And I get that the SEC punished, or in many ways didn't punish, but took that Oklahoma game, the non-conference game that Georgia had scheduled, away from the Bulldogs. But you also don't know that Georgia would have beaten Oklahoma. You don't know that. And you also don't know that Georgia would beat Texas. You don't know that because Texas beat Alabama. Alabama beat Georgia. Transitive properties don't really exist. But if you're going to schedule a crap schedule, if you're going to schedule Georgia Tech every year, if you're going to schedule teams like Tennessee Martin and Ball State and UAB in all your other games, you can't lose. And look, you had to know that coming in. You had to know it coming in. And you lose to Alabama. I think Alabama knocks off Georgia, knocks Georgia out of the playoff. I think Texas's win over Alabama puts them in over Alabama. Alabama needed Florida State to lose because if Florida State had lost, then I think you'd be looking at Michigan, Washington, Texas, and Alabama. But now with Florida State winning, I see it the way I think this goes and the way I think it should go is that you should have Michigan number 1, Washington number 2, Florida State number 3, and Texas number 4, which would set up a Texas-Michigan semifinal and a Washington-Florida State final, which, hey, I think with all those close games Washington's played, the Noles will probably have a shot, and especially when you consider that Florida State's going to have Tate Rodemaker back. And they won't have Jordan Travis, and that obviously makes a difference. And I think I was there live when Rodemaker was making his first start against Florida, and I was not overly impressed. But they now have a month to get their backup quarterback ready for this playoff. And I think to penalize them for going undefeated is the wrong thing to do. So, hey, that's what I got. I got Michigan, Washington, Florida State, and Texas. Certainly, I'm sure this is a controversial take. Put your comments down there. If you like what you've heard here, like, subscribe. We're going to be doing some stuff a little bit outside of Florida football on the YouTube channel this offseason, I am sure. We named this Read and Reaction for a reason. We focus on Florida, but we certainly are going to be expanding out of that as we go. So thank you so much for following us here. Thank you for listening to this. Like and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you've enjoyed this, and we'll give you more of it as the offseason goes on. So thanks so much. For Will Miles, go Gators.